Olympic sprinter refuses help from obese nurse, then she saves his life. The Olympic Games were in full swing. The stadium was packed with fans from all over the world, their cheers filling the air as they waved flags, chanted names, and celebrated the pinnacle of athleticism. For many athletes, this was the culmination of years of sweat, sacrifice, and dedication. For James "Thunder" Gordon, the American sprinter who had earned the nickname for his electrifying speed, this was his moment. James sat in the athletes' waiting area, a confident smirk plastered on his face. He was the reigning champion in the 100-meter sprint, and everyone knew it. Clad in his signature uniform, muscles rippling under the bright lights, James exuded the confidence of a man who was used to winning. The final was minutes away. The best sprinters in the world were lined up to challenge him, but James didn't seem fazed. He stretched leisurely, glancing occasionally at the other competitors as though sizing up the competition. He knew they were good, but he was better. Or so he thought. "Hey, James," his coach called, breaking his focus. "How's the leg?" James shrugged. "It's fine. I told you, it's nothing." But it wasn't nothing. James had felt a sharp pain in his hamstring during the semifinals the day before, and though he'd managed to push through it, the ache hadn't gone away. He had kept it to himself, not wanting to seem weak or draw attention to it. He had worked too hard to let anything stop him now. "Just let me know if it acts up," the coach said, concern flickering across his face. "Don't push yourself too hard." James waved him off. "I'm fine, coach. I've got this." The race was electric. As the starting gun fired, James exploded off the blocks like a bullet. The roar of the crowd was deafening as the sprinters tore down the track, their movements a blur of power and precision. For the first 50 meters, James was in the lead, just as everyone expected. But as he neared the finish line, something went wrong. The pain in his leg, which he had stubbornly ignored, surged with a vengeance. His stride faltered, and he felt a sharp, searing pull in his hamstring. James grimaced, his face contorted in pain as he stumbled across the finish line. He still managed to secure third place, but it was a far cry from the gold medal he had been gunning for. The crowd gasped as he collapsed onto the track, clutching his leg. Medics rushed to his side, their voices a blur as they asked him questions and assessed his injury. James felt his frustration boil over. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He was supposed to be on top, basking in glory, not writhing in pain on the ground. "Get me out of here," he snapped, waving off the medics. "I don't need help." Back in the athlete's medical center, James sat on the edge of a treatment table, his leg propped up as he waited impatiently for the doctor. He hated hospitals and medical centers. They smelled sterile and he didn't like feeling vulnerable. He crossed his arms, scowling. The door opened, and in walked a nurse. She was a large woman, her scrubs snug against her frame, with a kind smile that lit up her face. She carried a clipboard in one hand and a cup of water in the other. "Hi, Mr. Gordon," she said cheerfully. "I'm Nurse Clara. Let's take a look at that leg, shall we?" James frowned, his ego bruised and his temper short. "I'm fine. I don't need your help." Nurse Clara didn't seem fazed by his attitude. She set the clipboard down and pulled on a pair of gloves. "Well, you're here, so let's make sure you're fine. It won't take long." James glanced at her, his expression skeptical. "Are you even qualified for this?" Clara paused, raising an eyebrow. "Excuse me?" James shrugged. "I mean, shouldn't someone who works with athletes be, athletic?" Clara's smile faded slightly, but she kept her composure. "Mr. Gordon, I've been a nurse for over a decade. I've worked with patients of all kinds, including athletes. My job is to take care of you, not to impress you." James opened his mouth to respond, but Clara cut him off. "Now, if you'd like to continue this conversation, we can do it after I've made sure your leg isn't seriously injured." Despite his initial resistance, James let Clara examine his leg. Her touch was gentle but firm, her movements precise as she checked for signs of a tear or other damage. She asked him questions about the pain, her tone professional and calm. "Looks like a pulled hamstring," Clara said after a thorough examination. "You're going to need rest, ice, and some physical therapy to recover." James groaned, running a hand through his hair. I don't have time for rest. The season's not over yet. Clara gave him a pointed look. If you don't let this heal properly, you're going to make it worse. And then you'll have a lot more than one race to worry about. James scowled, but he knew she was right. He hated being sidelined, but he hated the thought of being permanently benched even more. Clara handed him a cup of water and a packet of painkillers. Take these for now. And try to be a little kinder next time someone tries to help you. We're not the enemy, Mr. Gordon. Over the next few days, James saw Clara frequently as she helped him with his recovery plan. Though their initial interactions had been tense, he began to notice how dedicated she was to her work. She treated every patient with the same level of care and attention, regardless of who they were or how they acted. One afternoon, as Clara was helping James with an ice pack, he asked, "Why do you do this?" "Deal with guys like me, I mean." Clara chuckled. "Because everyone needs help sometimes, even guys like you. And because I believe in what I do. Helping people heal, giving them a chance to get back to what they love, it's worth it." James looked at her, his expression softening. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, "for what I said before. That wasn't fair." Clara smiled. "Apology accepted. Just remember, strength comes in many forms, Mr. Gordon. It's not always about how fast you can run or how much you can lift." One night, after a grueling day of physical therapy, James returned to his room and turned on the TV. The news was reporting on the Olympic Games, highlighting various athletes and their journeys. To his surprise, a segment came on about Clara. The report detailed her work not just as a nurse, but as an advocate for mental health and body positivity in the athletic world. Clara had started a program that provided support and resources for athletes struggling with injuries, eating disorders, and other challenges. James watched, his respect for Clara growing with every word. He had misjudged her, dismissed her based on her appearance, and now he felt ashamed. Clara wasn't just a nurse, she was a hero in her own right. The next day, James sought Clara out. When he found her, he extended his hand. "Thank you," he said sincerely. "For everything." Clara shook his hand, her smile warm. "You're welcome. Now, let's get you back on that track." As James continued his recovery, he carried Clara's words with him. Strength comes in many forms. It was a lesson he wouldn't forget. The next few weeks were grueling for James as he worked through his recovery program. Clara remained a constant presence, guiding him through every step of the process. From therapy sessions to carefully monitored exercises, she was always there to ensure he didn't push too hard or take shortcuts that could jeopardize his progress. James, for the first time in his career, was learning the value of patience. He hated sitting on the sidelines watching his peers compete, but Clara's steady encouragement kept him grounded. She had a way of delivering hard truths with kindness, and even though he sometimes struggled with his pride, he listened to her. One day, during a particularly intense therapy session, Clara caught James grimacing as he attempted a set of stretches. She placed her hands on her hips and fixed him with a stern look. "James, you're overdoing it. You need to stop." "I'm fine," James said through gritted teeth, sweat dripping down his face. "I can handle it." Clara stepped forward, her voice firm but calm. "Pushing through pain isn't a sign of strength. It's a sign of recklessness. If you don't give your body the time it needs to heal, you're going to end up back at square one. Is that what you want?" James sighed, reluctantly lowering himself to the mat. "No," he muttered, avoiding her gaze. Clara crouched beside him, her expression softening. "I know this is hard for you. But healing isn't just physical, it's mental too. You have to learn to respect your limits. That's part of being an athlete." Her words struck a chord with James. He had always prided himself on being invincible, but this injury had humbled him in ways he hadn't expected. For the first time, he began to see Clara not just as a nurse, but as a mentor. As the days turned into weeks, James started to open up to Clara in ways he never had with anyone else. During their sessions, they talked about more than just his injury. He told her about his childhood, his strict upbringing, and the relentless pressure he had always felt to be the best. Clara listened without judgment, sharing bits and pieces of her own life in return. One afternoon, as they were finishing up a therapy session, James asked, "Clara, why did you decide to become a nurse? Clara smiled, leaning back against the wall. It's a long story, but if I had to sum it up, I'd say it's because I know what it's like to feel invisible. James frowned, confused. Invisible? What do you mean? Clara's smile faded slightly. When I was younger, I was always the one people overlooked. I wasn't the fastest, the smartest, or the prettiest. I didn't fit the mold of what people thought success should look like. But I knew I had something to offer. I just had to find a way to show it. James listened intently, her words resonating with him. So you became a nurse to help people see their worth? Clara nodded. Exactly. Everyone deserves to be seen and valued, no matter what they look like or where they come from. And if I can make even one person feel like they matter, then I've done my job. James was silent for a moment, her words sinking in. He realized that Clara had been doing that for him all along, helping him see beyond his injury, beyond his ego, to the person he truly was. One morning, James arrived at the therapy room to find Clara setting up equipment for his session. She looked up and smiled as he walked in, but before she could say anything, James held out a small gift bag. What's this? Clara asked, raising an eyebrow. Just open it, James said, a hint of nervousness in his voice. Clara pulled out a small box from the bag and opened it to reveal a custom bracelet. It was simple but elegant, with the words, "Strength comes in many forms," engraved on the inside. I figured it was about time I said thank you, James said, rubbing the back of his neck. For everything. You've taught me a lot, not just about recovering, but about what it really means to be strong. Clara's eyes softened as she slipped the bracelet onto her wrist. Thank you, James. This means more to me than you know. As James's recovery progressed, he began to regain his confidence. His leg grew stronger with each passing day, and he started to see glimpses of the athlete he had been before the injury. But more importantly, he felt like a better version of himself, more grounded, more aware, and more grateful. The day finally came when James was cleared to return to the track. Clara was there to see him off, her pride evident as she handed him a water bottle and adjusted the strap on his bag. You're ready, she said, her tone firm but encouraging. Go show them what you're made of. James nodded, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. I couldn't have done it without you, Clara. Thank you. James's return to competition was nothing short of spectacular. In his first race back, he not only won but set a new personal record. The crowd erupted in cheers as he crossed the finish line, his arms raised in victory. But as the cameras focused on him, James didn't bask in the glory alone. He pointed to the stands, where Clara sat watching, and mouthed the words, "This is for you." The moment went viral, with headlines praising James's comeback and the role Clara had played in his journey. Clara, ever humble, brushed off the attention, insisting that she had simply been doing her job. But James made sure everyone knew the truth. She didn't just help me heal, he said during an interview. She reminded me of what really matters. Strength, kindness, resilience, it all comes from the heart. And Clara has the biggest heart of anyone I've ever met. In the months that followed, James and Clara stayed in touch. Their unlikely friendship became a source of inspiration for others, sparking conversations about respect, humility, and the true meaning of strength. James continued to compete, but he also found himself advocating for causes close to Clara's heart, using his platform to support mental health and body positivity initiatives. One day, as they sat together after a charity event they had organized, James turned to Clara and said, "You know, I used to think being an Olympic champion was the most important thing in the world. But now I realize it's not about the medals. It's about the impact you make." Clara smiled, her eyes shining. "And you've made an impact, James. More than you know." As they clinked their glasses of water in a quiet toast, James couldn't help but feel grateful for the injury that had humbled him, for the nurse who had changed his perspective, and for the journey that had led him to this moment. Strength, he realized, really did come in many forms. And with Clara by his side, he felt stronger than ever. Months turned into a year, and James had fully regained his form as one of the world's fastest sprinters. The sports world couldn't stop talking about his comeback. A man who went from stumbling across the finish line in pain to becoming a two-time world champion. But for James, it wasn't just about the accolades anymore. Every time he competed, he carried Clara's lessons with him, knowing that strength wasn't measured solely by how fast he could run or how many records he could break. Clara had gone back to her regular duties at the hospital, her life unchanged on the surface but deeply enriched by her friendship with James. She'd become something of a local celebrity after James publicly credited her for his recovery, but she continued to downplay it. "I'm just doing my job," she'd tell reporters who called her for interviews, always redirecting the conversation to the importance of healthcare workers and the work they do. Still, Clara couldn't deny that her life had changed in ways she hadn't expected. The bracelet James had given her became a treasured item, a constant reminder of the impact she'd had. And every time she saw James on television, crossing the finish line with his hand over his heart, she felt a deep sense of pride, not just in him, but in herself. One day, James called Clara out of the blue. "Clara, I need your help," he said, his voice filled with urgency. Clara, who was in the middle of her shift, stepped into an empty hallway to take the call. "What's wrong?" she asked, her heart racing. "I'm organizing a charity event," James said. "It's for a foundation I'm starting, one that's focused on providing better medical care and support for athletes, especially those who are dealing with injuries or mental health challenges. I want you to be part of it." Clara hesitated. "James, I don't know. I'm not really the public speaking type." "You don't have to speak," James reassured her. "I just want you there. You're part of the reason this foundation exists in the first place. It wouldn't feel right if you weren't involved." Clara sighed, her resolve softening. She said, "But only if you promise not to make a big deal out of it." James laughed. "No promises." The event was held at a large convention center, with athletes, healthcare professionals, and community leaders in attendance. James had spared no expense, ensuring that the event was as impactful as it was memorable. The stage was adorned with banners displaying the foundation's motto, "Healing the body, strengthening the mind." Clara arrived early, dressed in a simple but elegant dress. She felt out of place among the glitz and glamour, but James greeted her at the entrance with a warm smile. "You look great," he said, giving her a quick hug. "Thank you for coming." "I still think this is too much," Clara said, glancing around at the lavish decorations. "It's not enough," James replied. "Not for what we're trying to do." As the evening progressed, James took the stage to deliver a speech. He spoke passionately about the challenges athletes face, both on and off the field, and the need for better support systems. He shared his own story, detailing the injury that had nearly ended his career and the nurse who had helped him find his way back. "I thought strength was about pushing through pain," James said, his voice steady but emotional. "But Clara taught me that true strength comes from knowing when to ask for help. She reminded me that we're all human, and that's nothing to be ashamed of." The audience erupted into applause, and Clara felt her cheeks flush as James gestured toward her. "Clara, will you come up here for a moment?" Clara shook her head, mouthing the word no from her seat, but James wasn't taking no for an answer. The crowd began cheering, encouraging her to stand, and Clara finally relented, making her way to the stage. James extended a hand to help her up, and when she turned to face the audience, the applause grew even louder. "This is Clara," James said, his arm around her shoulder. "She's the reason I'm standing here today. And she's proof that strength really does come in many forms." Clara managed a nervous smile, waving to the crowd as James continued. "This foundation is dedicated to people like her, people who work tirelessly behind the scenes to help others succeed. And tonight, I'm proud to announce that we're naming one of our key initiatives after her, the Clara Resilience Program." Clara's eyes widened in shock as the crowd erupted into another round of applause. She turned to James, her voice low. "James, you didn't have to do this." "I wanted to," James said simply. "You deserve it." The event was a resounding success, raising hundreds of thousands of dollars for the foundation. Clara, though initially overwhelmed by the attention, couldn't deny the sense of fulfillment she felt. She had spent years quietly doing her job, never expecting recognition, but now she realized that her work had made a difference in ways she hadn't fully appreciated. As the evening wound down, Clara and James sat together in a quiet corner of the convention center, watching as the guests began to leave. You're full of surprises, Clara said, sipping a glass of sparkling water. James grinned. I've learned from the best. Clara laughed, shaking her head. Seriously though, thank you. Not just for tonight but for everything. You've reminded me why I do what I do. James looked at her, his expression sincere. And you've reminded me why it's important to use what I've been given to help others. This foundation isn't just about me. It's about creating something that lasts, something that helps people long after I'm gone. Clara nodded, her heart swelling with pride. You're doing a good thing, James. And I'm honored to be part of it. In the months that followed, the Clara Resilience Program became one of the Foundation's most successful initiatives, providing resources and support to athletes, healthcare workers, and individuals in need. Clara continued her work at the hospital, but she also became more involved with the foundation, attending events and mentoring young nurses who wanted to make a difference. As for James, he continued to compete at the highest level, but his perspective on life had shifted. He no longer measured his success solely by the medals he won or the records he broke. Instead, he found joy in the connections he made and the lives he touched. One day, as James and Clara sat together at a charity event, he turned to her and said, "You know, I used to think my legacy would be the races I won. But now I realize it's the people I've been lucky enough to meet along the way. People like you." Clara smiled, her eyes shining with gratitude. "And I used to think I was just a nurse. But you've shown me that I'm so much more than that." Together, they had created something bigger than themselves, a testament to the power of resilience, kindness, and the belief that strength truly does come in many forms. Months turned into a whirlwind of activity as James's foundation gained momentum. The Clara Resilience Program was thriving, offering physical therapy scholarships to injured athletes, funding mental health resources for sports teams, and expanding its reach into local communities. Clara, once reluctant to step into the spotlight, found herself being interviewed on national platforms, her quiet humility a breath of fresh air in a world filled with high-profile personalities. But Clara wasn't the only one transforming. James, too, found a new sense of purpose beyond the track. He still trained and competed, but his post-race interviews began to focus less on his achievements and more on the causes he championed. He often spoke about Clara, her unwavering kindness, and how she had shaped his outlook on life. One day, during a foundation planning meeting, James turned to Clara with a grin. "I have an idea," he said, leaning forward across the table. Clara raised an eyebrow, skeptical. "That sounds dangerous." James laughed. "Hear me out. I want to organize a charity race, an open event where anyone can compete, regardless of their background or experience. We'll call it the Resilience Run." Clara's lips quirked into a small smile. "Resilience Run, huh? Sounds ambitious." "It is," James admitted. "But that's the point. It's not about who's the fastest. It's about showing up, giving it your all, and celebrating every step of the journey." Clara considered his words, nodding slowly. "But let's do it." Planning the Resilience Run was no small feat. James and Clara worked tirelessly alongside their team, reaching out to sponsors, securing permits, and promoting the event. James personally invited several athletes he had competed with over the years, while Clara connected with local hospitals and community centers, encouraging them to spread the word. The response was overwhelming. People from all walks of life signed up for the race. Young athletes eager to prove themselves, parents running with their children, individuals recovering from injuries, and even a few wheelchair participants. The event became a celebration of resilience in its many forms. On the morning of the race, Clara stood at the starting line, watching as participants gathered in their brightly colored running gear. She felt a lump rise in her throat as she took in the sheer diversity of the crowd. This wasn't just a race, it was a movement. James jogged up to her, his energy contagious. "Ready?" he asked, holding out a microphone. Clara blinked at him. "For what?" "To kick things off," James said, grinning. "Come on, Clara. You've got this." Clara hesitated, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. But then she remembered the countless times she had told others to believe in themselves, to step outside their comfort zones. She took a deep breath and nodded. Stepping up to the microphone, Clara's voice carried across the crowd. "Good morning, everyone. she began, her nerves fading as she saw the smiles on their faces. "Thank you for being here today. This race is about more than running. It's about resilience, about finding strength in ourselves and in each other. So let's make every step count." The crowd erupted into cheers, and Clara handed the microphone back to James, who gave her a wink. "Told you you'd be great?" The resilience run was a resounding success. As participants crossed the finish line, the air was filled with laughter, applause, and the occasional happy tear. James made it a point to personally congratulate as many runners as he could, while Clara manned the recovery tent, offering water and encouragement to those who needed it. One participant in particular stood out to Clara, a young boy named Ethan, who had crossed the finish line in a wheelchair with his parents running beside him. When Clara approached him, he beamed up at her, holding out a small, hand-drawn card. "Thank you for helping people like me," Ethan said, his voice shy but sincere. Clara felt tears prick her eyes as she accepted the card. "You're the one who's inspiring us, Ethan," she said, kneeling to meet his gaze. "Never forget how strong you are." In the weeks that followed, the resilience run became the talk of the town, with many participants sharing their stories on social media. Videos of Clara's opening speech and James's interactions with the runners went viral, sparking a wave of positivity and calls for more events like it. James and Clara couldn't have been prouder. The race had not only raised significant funds for the foundation but had also brought people together in a way that neither of them had anticipated. One evening, as they sat in James's office reviewing post-race feedback, he turned to Clara with a thoughtful expression. "You know, I never asked, what made you decide to work with me in the first place?" Clara looked at him, surprised. "What do you mean?" James shrugged. "I wasn't exactly the easiest patient. You could have handed me off to someone else, but you didn't." "Why?" Clara smiled, her gaze distant. "Because I saw potential in you, not just as an athlete, but as a person. I knew you had more to give than you realized. And I wanted to help you see that." James was quiet for a moment, her words sinking in. "Well, I'm glad you did," he said finally. "Because you didn't just help me heal, you changed my life." As the foundation continued to grow, so did James and Clara's friendship. They often joked that they made an unlikely pair, the flashy Olympic sprinter and the down-to-earth nurse, but they both knew that their differences were what made their partnership so powerful. One day, as they were wrapping up a meeting, James looked at Clara with a mischievous glint in his eye. "You know, Clara, I've been thinking." "That's never a good sign," Clara teased. James grinned. "We've done a lot of amazing things together, but there's one thing we haven't done yet." Clara raised an eyebrow. "And what's that?" "A race," James said, his grin widening. "You and me. One lap around the track." Clara laughed, shaking her head. "James, you do realize I'm not a runner, right?" "Doesn't matter," James said, his tone playful but determined. "It's not about winning, it's about showing up. Isn't that what you always say?" Clara rolled her eyes, but she couldn't help but smile. "Fine. But don't expect me to go easy on you." On the day of their race, a small crowd gathered at the track, made up of foundation staff, friends, and a few curious onlookers. James and Clara stood side by side at the starting line, both dressed in running gear. Clara looked over at James, her expression a mix of determination and amusement. "You ready to eat my dust?" she joked. James laughed. "We'll see about that." As the whistle blew, the two of them took off, the crowd cheering them on. James, of course, slowed his pace to match Clara's, but the look of joy on her face as they ran side by side was worth more than any gold medal. When they crossed the finish line together, hand in hand, the crowd erupted into applause. For James and Clara, it wasn't about who won or lost. It was about celebrating how far they had come, together. The buzz from the impromptu race spread across social media after one of the foundation staff members posted a video of James and Clara crossing the finish line together. The video, captioned, "True Champions Run Together," quickly went viral, garnering millions of views and comments from people who admired their camaraderie and the powerful message it symbolized. For Clara, the attention was surreal. She had spent so much of her life working in the background, helping others achieve their dreams, that being in the spotlight felt almost unnatural. But James, ever the charismatic showman, helped her navigate it with ease. One evening, after a particularly long day of interviews and planning sessions, Clara found herself sitting with James on the balcony of his home. The city lights sparkled below them, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of summer. Clara nursed a cup of tea while James sipped on a protein shake, both of them enjoying the quiet moment of reprieve. "You know," Clara said after a while, "when I first met you, I never would have imagined we'd end up here." James chuckled, leaning back in his chair. "Yeah, I wasn't exactly making a great first impression, was I?" Clara smiled, her eyes twinkling with amusement. "That's putting it mildly." James turned to her, his expression softening. "You saw something in me back then, something I didn't even see in myself. I don't think I ever properly thanked you for that." "You've thanked me plenty," Clara replied, waving a hand dismissively. "This foundation, everything we've done together, it's more than I ever could have imagined. But it's not just about the foundation," James said, his voice earnest. "You've changed the way I see the world, Clara. You've shown me that being strong doesn't mean doing everything alone. It means having the courage to lean on others when you need to." Clara looked at him, touched by his words. "Well, you've taught me a thing or two as well. Like how to stand in front of a crowd without fainting." They both laughed, the tension of the moment easing. But deep down, Clara knew there was truth in James's words. Their partnership had been transformative, not just for him, but for her as well. As the months went on, the foundation continued to expand its reach. New programs were launched, including workshops for young athletes, mental health initiatives, and community outreach events. Clara found herself busier than ever, juggling her work at the hospital with her growing role in the foundation. But despite the chaos, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. One day, during a meeting with the foundation's board of directors, James announced a new project that left everyone stunned. "We're building a rehabilitation center," he said, his voice brimming with excitement. "A state-of-the-art facility where injured athletes, like I once was, can receive the care and support they need to recover, both physically and mentally." The room buzzed with energy as the board members exchanged impressed looks. Claire, however, was speechless. "James," she said softly, "that's incredible." James grinned at her, clearly proud of the idea. "And I want you to help design it." Clara blinked, caught off guard. "Me? James, I'm not an architect or a designer." "No," James said, "but you're the heart of this foundation. You know better than anyone what athletes need when they're at their lowest. This center is as much yours as it is mine." Clara hesitated, overwhelmed by the responsibility. But as she looked around the room and saw the supportive faces of the team they had built together, she realized she couldn't say no. "All right," she said, nodding. "Let's do it." The months that followed were some of the busiest of Clara's life. She worked closely with architects, therapists, and medical professionals to design a facility that would cater to the unique needs of injured athletes. The building would include state-of-the-art therapy rooms, a hydrotherapy pool, meditation spaces, and even an outdoor track for rehabilitation exercises. But more importantly, it would be a space where athletes could feel seen, supported, and valued. James was equally involved, attending meetings and providing input whenever he could. But he also made it a point to ensure that Clara's vision was at the forefront. "This is your legacy too," he told her during one of their late-night planning sessions. "I want everyone who walks through those doors to know it." Clara smiled, touched by his unwavering belief in her. "Then let's make it something we're both proud of." The grand opening of the rehabilitation center was nothing short of spectacular. Athletes, healthcare workers, and community leaders from around the world gathered to celebrate the milestone. The building, sleek and modern, stood as a testament to everything James and Clara had worked for. As they stood together at the ribbon-cutting ceremony, James handed Clara a pair of scissors and gestured for her to take the lead. "This is your moment," he said, his voice filled with pride. Clara hesitated, her hands trembling slightly as she took the scissors. But as she looked out at the crowd, at the faces of the people who would benefit from the center, she felt a surge of confidence. With a quick snip, the ribbon fell, and the crowd erupted into cheers. Clara turned to James, her eyes shining with gratitude. "We did it," she said. James smiled, his hand resting on her shoulder. No, Clara. You did it. In the weeks that followed, the rehabilitation center quickly became a beacon of hope for injured athletes. Stories of recovery and resilience poured in, each one a testament to the power of the work they had done. Clara, though still humble to a fault, couldn't help but feel a deep sense of pride every time she walked through the building's halls. One day, as she was leaving the center, she bumped into a young sprinter who had just completed his first therapy session. He looked up at her with wide eyes, clearly starstruck. "You're Clara, right?" he asked, his voice tinged with awe. "The nurse who helped James?" Clara smiled, nodding. "That's me." The young sprinter hesitated, then said, "I just wanted to say thank you. What you've done here, it's amazing. People like me wouldn't have a chance without it." Clara felt her throat tighten as she placed a hand on his shoulder. "You're the reason we're here," she said. "Never forget that." Later that evening, Clara met up with James at a local cafe. The two of them had fallen into the habit of catching up over coffee, their conversations ranging from work to life to everything in between. As they sipped their drinks, James leaned back in his chair and said, "You know, Clara, I think we've built something pretty incredible." Clara nodded, a soft smile on her lips. "But there's still so much more to do." James chuckled. "Always the overachiever." Clara laughed, shaking her head. "Says the guy who can't go a day without training." James grinned, raising his cup in a toast. "To resilience, then." "To resilience," Clara agreed, clinking her cup against his. As they sat together, the weight of everything they had accomplished settled over them. They had started as strangers, an injured athlete and a compassionate nurse, but together, they had created something that would outlast them both. And in that moment, under the warm glow of the cafe lights, they knew that their journey was far from over. As the days passed, the rehabilitation center became more than just a facility. It became a sanctuary, a home for people seeking to rebuild their lives. Athletes from all over the world came, not just for physical therapy but also for the emotional and mental support they needed to recover. Clara's influence could be seen everywhere, from the warmth of the staff to the personalized care plans for each patient. James, as busy as he was with his career, made it a priority to visit the center every week. He didn't just come as the face of the foundation. He came as a friend, a mentor, and a symbol of resilience. He would spend hours talking to patients, sharing his own journey, and encouraging them to find their strength. One afternoon, as James walked through the therapy wing, he noticed a young woman struggling on the treadmill. She was wincing with every step, her face twisted in pain, but her determination was undeniable. James approached her, his tone gentle. "Hey there," he said. "You're doing great. Mind if I join you?" The young woman, startled, glanced at him with wide eyes. "James Carter," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's me," James replied with a smile. "But today, I'm just a guy cheering you on. What's your name?" "Lila," she said, blushing slightly. "Well, Lila, you're one of the strongest people I've seen today," James said, stepping onto the treadmill next to her. "Keep going. One step at a time." Lila nodded, a flicker of hope in her eyes. For the rest of her session, James stayed by her side, talking to her about her goals, her struggles, and her dreams. By the time she stepped off the treadmill, she was smiling, a small but significant victory. Meanwhile, Clara was in her office, reviewing applications for a new scholarship program they had launched. The program was designed to support aspiring healthcare workers, particularly those from underprivileged backgrounds. As she read through the stories of the applicants, Clara felt a deep sense of responsibility. These were people who wanted to make a difference, just as she had all those years ago. One application in particular caught her attention. It was from a young man named Marco, who had grown up in foster care and dreamed of becoming a physical therapist. His essay was raw and honest, detailing the challenges he had faced and the resilience he had developed as a result. Clara picked up her phone and dialed James. "You need to read this," she said as soon as he answered. "Read what?" James asked, amused. "An application for the scholarship program," Clara replied. "This kid, Marco, his story is incredible. I think he's exactly the kind of person we're trying to help. "Send it over," James said. "I'll take a look." A week later, Marco was invited to the center for an interview. Clara and James both sat in on the meeting, eager to learn more about the young man who had captured their attention. Marco was nervous at first, but as he spoke about his experiences and his dreams, his passion shone through. "I've seen what it's like to feel invisible," Marco said, his voice steady. "But I've also seen how much of a difference one person can make. I want to be that person for someone else." By the end of the interview, Clara and James exchanged a glance, their decision clear. Marco was offered the scholarship on the spot, and his journey to becoming a physical therapist began. As the months rolled on, the rehabilitation center continued to grow. Patients who had once been broken in body and spirit were leaving with newfound strength and confidence. The Clara Resilience Program had become a beacon of hope, and its impact was being felt far and wide. One day, as Clara was walking through the center, she was stopped by an older man in a wheelchair. He looked up at her with tears in his eyes, holding a small, crumpled photograph in his hand. "Miss Clara," he said, his voice trembling. "I don't know if you remember me, but you helped my grandson, Ethan, during the resilience run." Clara's heart swelled with recognition. "Of course I remember Ethan," she said, kneeling beside the man. "How is he doing?" The man smiled, his tears spilling over. "He's doing great. He's walking again, thanks to this center. I just wanted to thank you for everything you've done." Clara placed a hand on his shoulder, her own eyes glistening. "It's not just me," she said softly. "It's everyone here. But I'm so glad to hear Ethan is doing well. He's an incredible kid." The man handed her the photograph, which showed Ethan standing tall with a medal around his neck. "He wanted me to give you this," he said, "to show you how far he's come." Clara took the photograph, her heart full. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "This means more to me than you know." Meanwhile, James was preparing for what would be one of the biggest races of his career, a chance to break a world record. But this time, his motivation was different. It wasn't just about proving himself, it was about honoring the journey that had brought him here. On the day of the race, Clara stood in the crowd, cheering louder than anyone. As the starting gun fired, James took off like a bullet, his every movement a testament to the hard work and determination he had poured into his training. The crowd roared as James crossed the finish line, not just breaking the record but shattering it. He fell to his knees, overcome with emotion, as the stadium erupted into cheers. Clara made her way to the track, her heart swelling with pride. When James saw her, he got to his feet and pulled her into a tight hug. "We did it," he whispered. "No," Clara said, her voice filled with conviction. "You did it." That night, as they celebrated James's victory, Clara couldn't help but reflect on how far they had come. From that first meeting in the hospital to this moment of triumph, their journey had been nothing short of extraordinary. As the party wound down, James raised a glass, his voice cutting through the chatter. "To Clara," he said, his tone sincere. "The person who taught me what it means to be truly strong." The room fell silent as everyone turned to Clara, who felt her cheeks flush. But before she could protest, the room erupted into applause, their appreciation overwhelming. Clara looked at James, her eyes shining with gratitude. "Thank you," she said softly. "For everything." James smiled, his gaze steady. "No, Clara. Thank you." In the years that followed, James and Clara's partnership continued to flourish. Together, they built a legacy that would outlast them both, a testament to the power of resilience, kindness, and the unshakable bond they had formed. And as they looked back on their journey, they knew one thing for certain: they had made every step count.